All right, we're live again. Let me actually make sure that we actually are live again. What the hell? Okay, we are live again. Okay. Sorry, just had to make sure. All right, just gonna go right back into it. Oh my god. Oh my god, bro. Okay.
Did you know certain trees and plants can reduce your wildfire risk? Understand how wildfires spread and how to protect your home. Learn more at makeyourhomeresilient.ca.
All right.
Right. Okay, so I'll introduce this document.
Right. Okay. So
Next objection, the stalking horse objection. Alex Malpass and I had a whole debate about this, and I have refined my thoughts and so on and so forth. But the objection is basically that we're comparing apples to oranges when we say that theism better predicts the life-permitting values to naturalism. Naturalism is a very general hypothesis, whereas theism is a very specific version of the design hypothesis, the general stipulation that there is a designer. And you'll notice that that general hypothesis doesn't seem to uniquely predict that the constants would be life-permitting, because for all we know, there could be a designer that favors any sort of value for the constants. Whereas it's only when we zero in on theism that we get the predictive power. And so what Alex's point is that we should similarly consider a specific version of naturalism against theism as the relevant competitor. And specifically, he says, let's consider the augmented naturalistic hypothesis that the universe has a natural disposition to tend towards life-permitting values of the constants. That hypothesis makes it highly likely that the constants would be life-permitting. And his point is that no matter the level of improbabilities involved, and no matter the piece of evidence involved, you can give this kind of stalking horse objection. There's always an augmented naturalistic hypothesis in the neighborhood which can match theism in terms of its predictive power for the relevant evidence. What do we think about that, Joe?
Yeah, so for the audience, we are a bit tight on time, so we're just going to be relatively brief and blitzkrieg through some of our responses, and we completely recognize that there are counter-responses that can be made by like our mutual good friends, Troy Dana and Alex Malpass. Very amazing people. Wrong about this sort of thing, but they're still amazing. They're still great. No, but anyway, Troy and I have like reproduced a dialectic which like goes like a dozen layers deep in his responses, my counter responses. So there are counter responses to what we're about to say, and I think there are counter responses to whatnot. But anyway, so one worry for this style of reasoning is that like it seems to prove too much. There doesn't seem to be a limiting principle for this kind of stalking horse objection, because we can again give the awesome theological argument. It seems like you could make the exact same response to the awesome theological argument. I mean, again, imagine that the initial conditions spell out in all the languages of the world, made by God with love. And actually, we can even suppose that like those initial conditions are needed for our existence to eventually come about, for there to be any generalizations about what agents tend to do. Like we can even imagine that there's like some sort of like a priori connection between those initial conditions and us coming about, such that like these generalizations about us like logically entail stuff about those initial conditions. We could even imagine, and I think the stalking horse objection like would rightly fall on deaf ears in that case. Like clearly this is very powerful evidence for a designer, and in particular for theism, even though I think the stalking horse objection would imply that it is no such thing. Again, responses are available, but let's just move on to a second response. I think a second response is just that like some designers are much more probable than others because they're simpler in theoretical terms, they're more compactly describable in fundamental terms, they're less arbitrary, they don't have arbitrary limits, they're highly coherent hypotheses which can be described with very clean universal generalizations, like being all powerful, having all knowledge, being all good, and those sorts of things. I think theism has lots of these theoretical virtues that give it a much higher prior than most other forms of the designer hypothesis.
all right. Yeah. So I blitzed through a lot of that just because I wanted to get through some of it, because I'm going to let you respond to the points that Joe made there, because I know you have to go soon. So that's why I went through a lot of it without pausing. So without further ado, I'll let you go, and then I'll make my response to that after.
Sure. So yeah, the stalking horse objection. I mean, I'm somewhat sympathetic actually to the idea that it may prove too much, but I think that the best way of setting it up, that its proponents kind of want to set it up this way, is to say that it's actually the bare hypotheses, it's bare theism and bare naturalism that are not sort of rich enough to make the kinds of empirical predictions that are necessary to say that one is favored by an empirical observation over the other. So like Troy will say like bare design versus bare non-design, so just the idea that there's a single universe and it was designed versus there's a single universe and it wasn't designed. And I think that a lot of the stalking horse stuff is meant to say that, like, yes, look, you could give me cases like star writing, you could give me cases like the one Joe outlined, where he was saying, you see, that nobody would listen to the stalking horse here. But the point is that those kinds of observations are going to support narrower sub-hypotheses of theism, perhaps. Right, like if the Gospel of John was written in the stars, that may support a sort of specific Christian theism. Right. But broadly, the idea is supposed to be that things like fine tuning don't favor bare theism over bare naturalism. And then there are certain Bayesian. So Detroit Troy Dana has an argument that has a Bayesian structure to it that has two premises, and well, I should say it has two premises that are the contentious ones. Mainly just the second premise, which says that the conditional probability of life-permitting universe given bare design does not exceed the conditional probability of a life-permitting universe given bare non-design. And that's kind of I look at that as like the basis of the spirit of the stalking horse. And I think it's somewhat compelling to think that there just isn't enough content there in bare design to say that no, it does exceed the probability of life-permitting conditions given bare non-design. So I don't have a whole lot else to say about that. Like I said, I'm somewhat sympathetic to thinking that this line maybe does prove too much. If it's if what's relevant is that, like, well, look, this data really strongly supports specific sub-hypotheses of theism over all sub-hypotheses of naturalism, right? If that's the argument being made, then I don't really think stalking horse is a good objection to it. But, yeah.
Interesting. If you want to head out, or if you want to hang around for like a few more minutes, that's fine too. But yeah, I mean, it was good. Definitely having you on as a guest. We can maybe do.
Yeah, I appreciate the invite, man. Yeah, I probably will. I have to head out now, but I appreciate you having me for this. It was a lot of fun. We'll definitely be open to doing it again sometime. Maybe we can do psychophysical harmony or something.
Yeah, maybe we can even bring other people on, like Sebastian or Bray or whatever.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Yep. All right. Well, peace, and have a good rest of your day.
You too. Good luck with the rest of this. Joe Schmid and Miles Donahue. All right. I'll talk to you later, man.
Yeah, talk to you later. Okay, looks like I am on my own now, and I'm gonna go back, because the only reason I went this far is because I wanted to give him a chance to respond to a lot of the points that Joe was saying here. But me personally, I'm going to take them apart more one by one.
Of improbabilities involved, and no matter the piece of evidence involved, you can give this kind of stalking horse objection. There's always an augmented naturalistic hypothesis in the neighborhood which can match theism in terms of its predictive power for the relevant. What do we think about that, Joe?
Yeah, so for the audience, we are a bit tight on time, so we're just going to be relatively brief and blitzkrieg through some of our responses, and we completely recognize that there are counter-responses that can be made by like our mutual good friends, Troy Dana and Alex Malpass. Very amazing people, wrong about this sort of thing, but they're still amazing, they're still great. No, but anyway, Troy and I have like reproduced a dialectic which like goes like a dozen layers deep in his responses and my counter responses. So there are counter responses to what we're about to say, and I think there are kind of counter responses to whatnot. But anyway, so one worry for this style of reasoning is that like it seems to prove too much. There doesn't seem to be a limiting principle for this kind of stalking horse objection, because we can again give the awesome theological argument. It seems like you could make the exact same response to the awesome theological argument. I mean, again, imagine that the initial conditions spell out all the languages of the world made by God with love. And actually, we can even suppose that like those initial conditions are needed for our existence to eventually come about, and if there to be any generalizations about what agents tend to do. Like we can even imagine that there's like some sort of like a priori connection between those initial conditions and us coming about, such that like these generalizations about us like logically entail stuff about those initial conditions. We could even
Let me actually go back and repeat that.
Us coming about, such that like these generalizations about us like logically entail stuff about those initial conditions. We could even tend to do. Seems like you could make the exact same response to the awesome theological argument. I mean, again, imagine that the initial conditions spell out in all the languages of the world, made by God with love. And actually, we can even suppose that like those initial conditions are needed for our existence to eventually come about, and for there to be any generalizations about what agents tend to do. Like we can even imagine that there's like some sort of like a priori connection between those initial conditions and us coming about. Initial conditions and us coming. Those sort of like a priori connection between.
I'm just trying to figure out the point about the generalization about agents, because that's a bit confusing me.
We can even suppose that like those initial conditions are needed for our existence to eventually come about, and for there to be any generalizations about what agents tend to do. Like we can even imagine that there's like some sort of like a priori connection between those initial conditions and us coming about, such that like these generalizations about us like logically entail stuff about those initial conditions. We could even imagine, and I think the stalking horse objection like would rightly fall on deaf ears in that case. Like clearly this is very powerful evidence for a designer, and in particular for theism, even though I think the stalking horse objection would imply that it is no such thing. Again, responses are available, but let's just move on to a second response.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'm sensitive to the fact that like maybe what I'm about to say here might be something that, you know, has already been covered in the, I don't know, like 700 dialogue trees deep discussion between Joe and Troy. But so how are we to approach these like thought experiments with awesome theological evidence? Well, so I think it's worth stepping back and like thinking like what is the value of a thought experiment? What epistemic import is there to these sorts of thought experiments, right? Because typically the way that the awesome theistic argument is run is just that we imagine some scenario, some putative example, like the stars writing out the Gospels of John, or the initial conditions writing out the Gospel of John, and we just have like a really strong intuition about this thought experiment that that upon encountering this evidence, we would think that it's strong evidence for theism, and so. But I don't think that methodology is very good. I don't think we should just like, you know, come up with the thought experiment and then have an intuition about it and then move on with our days. I think it's important to examine why the reasoning, the sort of inductive inference from observing the Gospel of John in the initial conditions and inferring from that observation to theism. What, if anything, and it could turn out at the end of the inquiry that the inductive inference isn't warranted. But if it is, then what is it that warrants that inductive inference? So the way I think about thought experiments is their import is as, well, they have like a variety of different possible imports. Like they can be used as inspirations for constructing theories, as is Galileo's famous thought experiment with the feather and the I can't remember what it was, the feather and the hammer. I don't know, which later turned out to prove that objects with greater mass don't fall faster than objects with lighter mass. In certain conditions. And then I think that there was another thought experiment that inspired Einstein to come up with general relativity, or was it special relativity or general relativity? I don't know. But thought experiments have many functions, but insofar as they are to be used in a philosophical context, I think that their import would be as arguments. And so when I encounter this sort of appeal to awesome theistic evidence, I just don't think that we should just be having like an intuition about it, because thought experiments don't like put us in like a mind portal to Plato's heaven or something like that, where we just, you know, get access to the truth just by thinking about some thought experiment and having an intuition about it, right? I want to know, what are the premises of the argument, and are the premises of the argument motivated? So the awesome theistic argument analogy, and as it applies to, a sort of parody argument to respond to these responses to the fine-tuning argument, like stalking horse, they're going to have like a general structure like this. The awesome theistic argument is strong evidence for theism and is not defeated by X objection. And then the next premise is going to be something like, if this, then and then conclusion. Yeah. So, I prefer to think of it as when the awesome theistic argument is appealed to, it's just sort of as a shorthand for an argument that looks like this. So, premise 1: if the ATA is strong evidence for theism, the ATA is strong evidence for theism and is not defeated by X objection. So premise 2: if the ATA is strong evidence for theism and is not defeated by X objection, then X objection does not defeat the fine-tuning argument. And then conclusion: X objection does not defeat the fine-tuning argument. So why am I going through all these hoops? Because I just want to be clear on what the reasoning is and what the evidence for the premises are. Because a lot of the times I feel like use of thought experiments in philosophy is really sloppy. That we just have a thought experiment, intuition, and then we win. Like I just intuitioned you. That's not how I want to think about this. And I think that I have a meta philosophy that's very much unlike Joe and Miles, where I don't think that seemings by default are these innocent until proven guilty states. I think that seemings could be justifiers, but they're only justifiers when we have when they're properly trained in the right sort of way to track truth. So I don't think that the seemings of an astrologer are evidentially relevant, but I do think that the seemings of an astronomer looking at the night sky is relevant, because I think that in acquiring substantial training in astronomy, the astronomer gains a set of skills that greatly surpasses the layman. Such that, and this is an example that Paul Churchill uses in a paper I don't remember, but that they can distinguish various different celestial bodies in the sky and their differences, and even various mathematical facts about them, just by a glance. And this is just from adopting a penetrating conceptual framework of astrology. Now, I'm kind of going very off point here, but the reason why I'm being very careful about this sort of argument is because I have a very specific epistemology of thought experiments. And I don't think it's good to just sort of hand-wavy gesture at a thought experiment and then declare that you've won without actually thinking carefully about what the evidence is for the claim that the thought experiment is getting at. And so in particular, we have two premises here. Now, the first premise is that I would call it like the intuition premise, perhaps. The awesome theistic argument is strong evidence for theism and is not defeated by X objection. And what X objection is, like, you can substitute it for many different objections to the fine-tuning argument. There's the constants are necessary objection. There's this, obviously in this case, the stalking horse objection, the divine psychology objection, whatever. And I do think that what you substitute in for X objection might actually affect the soundness of the argument. But in any case, should we think that the awesome theistic argument is strong evidence for theism and is not defeated by X objection? Well, it's kind of hard to evaluate counterfactuals in this way, but I think that we can reason about this by thinking about which inductive arguments are good. What would the inductive reasoning be in a context where we're presented with an awesome theistic argument? And as I sort of alluded to in the last stream, I buy into a sort of material theory of induction, where I think that what inductive inferences are warranted depends on the background material facts about the that are local to whatever domain we're inductively projecting over, or like what facts we know in the background. So I mean, I know I've been citing John Norton quite a bit, but he is a very good philosopher, and as you can probably tell, I'm very inspired by his approach to a lot of these things. But anyways, an example he uses is the difference between an inductive inference on a sample of the melting point of some sample of wax and the melting point of some sample of bismuth. Now, you could observe some sample of wax and say, okay, so the melting point of wax is like, let's say 90 degrees or something like that. And then you inductively project that to all samples of wax. The problem is the background facts don't warrant the strength of that inductive inference, because wax is just a name for some generic class of substances that aren't really a natural kind. And so inductive projections from an individual sample of wax are quite weak. Whereas bismuth is a natural kind, and there is no relevant difference between this particular sample of bismuth versus other samples of bismuth that would make it the case that the melting point of this sample of bismuth is unrepresentative with respect to other samples of bismuth. So what's warranting the inductive inference is a local background fact. And what I would say about the awesome theistic evidence case is something similar. Insofar as it's strong evidence for theism, there's got to be some domain-specific background fact that warrants the inductive inference to theism. And in particular, I think that the background facts here, assuming that there are background facts here, are going to be things like our knowledge about agents and how symbols with semantic content are created, together with our background knowledge about the normal behavior of the stars in ordinary circumstances where the laws of nature are acting as they would in ordinary physical systems or whatever. And so suppose the background facts were such that regularly stars in the sky lined up in such a way to produce messages with a semantic content, and they were known to do that as a result of these like stochastic physical processes that have nothing to do with agency. Well, in that case, we wouldn't have the requisite background knowledge to infer design from a message in the sky. And so in that sort of world, if we're evaluating this counterfactual of awesome theistic evidence or whatever, in a counterfactual world where those background facts are the case, or other background facts like agents aren't known to produce symbols with semantic content or whatever. In those cases, I think that the inductive inference would fail. But assuming we're talking about a case where we are holding our background knowledge about agents and material facts about the normal behavior of stars fixed, then I do think that the inductive inference goes through. But it goes through because those material facts are operant and warrant the strength of that inductive inference. So whether this premise is sound depends on that. And then we have the parity premise, or the companions in guilt premise. And again, whether this premise is true depends on what you substitute for X objection. I don't think the first premise depends on what you substitute for X objection, because I think that plausibly the inductive inference goes through because the background facts warrant it, or it doesn't. And X objection is just going to be irrelevant to that. But for this case, this conditional, if the ATA is strong evidence for theism and is not defeated by X objection, then X objection does not defeat the fine-tuning argument. This is the premise that I would attack, because, absent any argument, presumably the sort of inference that warrants the fine-tuning argument is going to be nothing like the inductive inference that warrants the ATA argument. And so it just doesn't seem like it's going to follow from the ATA being defeated by X objection that this consequent follows, that X objection does not defeat the fine-tuning argument, because the reasoning, the inductive inference just isn't the same, right? The background facts warrant the inductive inference in this case, but they don't warrant the inductive inference in this case. In fact, there doesn't appear to be background facts that would warrant the use of like an inference to design in the fine-tuning case at all. Like, we don't have any background information about agents fine-tuning constants or whatever. Now, maybe you can say that we have background information about agents creating life, but that would just understate what the background evidence is, because the agents that we know that create life create it through self-replicating reproductive machinery that was evolved through years of natural selection. So what our background knowledge actually says is that biological organisms who specifically evolved through natural selection, which selects for reproductive success, desire to create life. But that sort of inductive inference, when you apply it to a designer who we have reason to think wouldn't be a biological organism, and if they are, then we're not talking about God. So then it would just be irrelevant to the theist argument anyways. But assuming we are talking about God, then the cross-domain inductive inference wouldn't work in that case. Whereas in this case, first of all, I think that the inference would be to design, perhaps not theism. I mean, it depends on what your priors are in theism, but certainly I would update in favor of. I think it would be rational to update in favor of design, and whether it would be rational to update on theism in particular. With the Gospel of John case, we also have further background information about religious texts, and so given that we know that the Gospel of John has like several thousand words and is embedded in a specific religious tradition, then I think that, like, plausibly there would be some inductive inference to theism there, in virtue of the fact that, we have like this independent tradition, this independent theistic tradition that the star writing case, the semantic content of the message in the star writing case is just identical to a passage that's directly associated with that religious tradition. So perhaps I'm just going to leave that as ambiguous. But let's say we grant that it does warrant an inductive inference to theism in virtue of that background fact. Well, still the case is going to be that even if it does, the relevant background facts just aren't going to be there in the fine-tuning case. Okay. And whether we have, so we might even have positive reason to think that premise 2 is false, because if we substitute in a specific objection, there might be positive reason to think that it would apply to the fine-tuning argument, but wouldn't apply to the awesome theistic argument. So I haven't given reasons to think that the premise is false. I've just been sort of arguing that it's unmotivated. It's an unmotivated argument. Sorry. So let's say we substitute X objection for, say, well, I guess we should just immediately go to the stalking horse objection. Let's say we substitute X objection for the stalking horse objection. I'm not going to bother writing it out for all of them. But, yeah. Okay. Then, do we have, so once we substitute for the stalking horse objection, do we have reason to think that the stalking horse objection, if it doesn't apply to the ATA case, then it doesn't apply to the fine-tuning. So if it applies to the fine-tuning case, then it applies to the ATA case. or vice versa. If it applies to the AT case, then it applies to the fine-tuning case. I guess you could run this argument as a modus tollens or a modus tollens. But I just chose to represent it as the modus tollens here. Anyways. For the ATA case, I think the stalking horse objection would just be irrelevant because it would just be a case where our background evidence already favors a design hypothesis. Because Troy's point, as I understand it, is that the evidence doesn't favor bare design over bare non-design. But in the ATA case, you could it seems plausible that if the inductive inference goes through, then the evidence does favor bare design in that case. Unlike in the fine-tuning case where Troy argues that it doesn't favor bare design. So it seems like there's a positive disanalogy here, if anything. So I guess I would say that not only is this premise unmotivated, but when we substitute X objection for the stalking horse objection, I just think that it's plausibly false because in the ATA case, the inductive inference directly bears on bare design, whereas if Troy's argument is right, the evidence doesn't directly bear on bare design. Like Troy's argument only goes through if the evidence doesn't favor bare design. So that would be the disanalogy there. All right. That was a lot of words, but I just wanted to pick apart this sort of argument carefully. And there's also other substitutions that you can put in for X objection, and to what extent the argument fails depends on like what substitution you put in here. But I think even if you just leave the argument like this, where you don't make a substitution, you just leave it as like X objection is just some like variable that you can like substitute in for anything. I think that even without that, this argument, this premise here is just unmotivated. Like I don't see any reason to believe it's true, and I don't think I've ever seen an argument that it's true. And so that's why I think it's important to formalize these thought experiments as arguments, because then you can locate where the reasoning is, and you can locate if the premises are well supported. And I think in this case, we have a premise here that's I just don't see what the argument for it is, and I don't see what the evidence for it is. Yeah. In so many words, I don't think that the awesome theistic argument works.
I think the second response is just that like some designers are much more probable than others because they're simpler in theoretical terms, they're more compactly describable in fundamental terms, they're less arbitrary, they don't have arbitrary limits, they're highly coherent hypotheses which can be described with very clean universal generalizations, like being all powerful, having all knowledge, being all good, those sorts of things. I think theism has lots of these theoretical virtues that give it a much higher prior than most other forms of the designer hypothesis. And it's not terribly unlikely that a theistic designer specifically would value a life-permitting universe, since that enables lots of profound goods, and God, of course, being a perfect being, would be motivated by the good. And personally speaking, I just think it's like highly implausible to treat the design hypothesis' predictions as equivalent to chance, since it's not like hopelessly unlikely that a designer would be sensitive to value or reasons in the way that their bodies.
Right. So this is a separate objection. Okay. So the first thing he says there is about favoring design hypotheses that are compactly describable and like simpler and expressible in clean universal generalizations. Right. So I mean, we sort of talked about this earlier when Sully was on, but yeah. I mean, maybe like it's more plausible in this case because what we're appealing to is the simplicity of hypotheses rather than the simplicity of possible, laws that a given hypothesis predicts or whatever. Right. So, what to say about the point about simplicity and like arbitrary limits and stuff like that? Well, I mean, I guess first I'll take on the arbitrary limits argument. I've never been really personally compelled by the arbitrary limits argument. Like, I don't like see the reason to believe that hypotheses with less arbitrary limits. Well, maybe I should be careful with my wording here. I think you shouldn't have arbitrary limits to the exact extent that you shouldn't posit anything arbitrary onto a theory. So you shouldn't have arbitrary limits in the same way that you shouldn't have arbitrary redness. And importantly, I think that the very same reason why we shouldn't have arbitrary limits is the same reason to think that we shouldn't have arbitrary powers. So you shouldn't just stack on powers to a theory, make claims about powers, the powers that a theoretical posit has, if, the evidence doesn't suggest it. And I think that, typically what's said here is, for any arbitrary limit, why that limit rather than, slightly less of a limit or slightly more of a limit? So why a limit of power of degree n rather than degree n plus 1 and minus 1? But I just don't see why that's any different from positing powers of a being. Like, okay, for any power you posit of a being, why that power rather than the absence of that power, or why that degree of power rather than some other degree of power? And I guess what they would say is once you have a limited power, there is no upper bound in the power. But why that degree of power and not slightly less power? I can just say the same thing. What's so special about unlimited power that it just has this extreme bias in favor of it? And I think that the point is just parallel. I don't see the motivation for thinking that powers, tacking on powers to a theory is better and more virtuous and makes a theory, it packs in more, Bayesian prior points or whatever. It gives, it ups the Bayes number, it ups the prior number. I just don't see the reason to think that that's right. And I haven't really seen a convincing reason to think that that's right. But sort of losing my train of thought here because I'm a bit. I've been at this for a long time, so. But okay. So that's a first point. A second point is the point about compact descriptions, and I sort of alluded to some of the things that I would say here earlier, but I just don't think that what makes a description compact is just relative to just some arbitrary choice of a language, right? Sure, maybe omnipotence is a compact, property relative to, English language predicates. So, we could express it in a few words for all actions, God can do them. For all states of affairs, God can bring them about. For all propositions, God knows them, right? But it's trivially easy to come up with deviant predicates where what is a universal generalization in our language turns out to be a non-universal generalization in another language with these sort of groupified deviant predicates. So an example that I like to use because it's general is imagine you have some predicate x limited, where an x limited being can do all things within some domain or subject matter x, and can't do things outside subject matter x. And then you can imagine another predicate where y limited being can do all things outside subject matter x, but can't do anything within subject matter x. So from the perspective of a language that takes x limited and y limited properties as fundamental, in fact, unlimitedness is the complex property, because you could build, because what they would do is they would build the concept of unlimitedness up out of these more deviant limitedness properties. So what an unlimited being is a being who's x limited for all actions in domain x and y limited for all actions outside domain x. And so if the predicates you choose to use are x limited predicates and y limited predicates, then from the perspective of a language that uses those predicates, unlimitedness seems very bizarre and gerrymandered. And this is just a sort of general point, and you can imagine substituting x limitedness for any variety of limited properties. And you can clearly state limited. You can clearly state the X limited beings property, let's say we call the X limited being super X, you can state their properties in a compact way. So let's say we introduce another predicate, X actions. For all X actions, the being super X can do them. Or imagine we introduce another predicate, replace the predicate of propositions with X propositions. For all X propositions, super X knows them. So what this illustrates is that it's pretty cheap and easy to come up with a theory that has these like universal generalizations built into them. It's just a matter of your language choice. And sometimes like what's appealed to is like, oh, like maybe these other predicates are less Kolmogorov complex, but they're more complex. But whether or not they have more Kolmogorov complexity is just a function of like what binary encoding scheme you choose to do. Like from the perspective of a language that takes the X limited and Y limited properties as fundamental, they would just like insist upon a binary encoding, or X limited properties get like a very compressible string, a binary string. So I don't think that there's realistically a way of avoiding this point about language relativity. But okay, now let's say we set aside this point about reified properties. There's still the point that let's say that omnipotence is more probable than any given finite deity hypothesis or finite limited theistic hypothesis. There's still 2 points that I could make in response to that. The first point is that, well, what unlimited theism has in, I guess, coherence and like compressibility, if you want to say, it loses in modesty when we compare it to a generic limited being hypothesis, because the generic limited being hypothesis is, if you think about it, the disjunction of all specific limited being hypotheses, whereas unlimited being theism is one specific theistic hypothesis. It's the hypothesis where the power and knowledge parameters are tuned up to infinity, whereas there's like many different limited being hypotheses that vary in degree n plus 1, blah blah blah, like various transformations you can do on the degrees of power and knowledge or whatever. So the question is whether unlimited being theism, what it gains in its coherence, I guess, it makes up for in its immodesty relative to limited being theism. And another point is that's not often appreciated is, what about fit with background information? Most beings most agents we know of are not unlimited. Like, in fact, no beings we know of are unlimited. Every single human being we know is a limited being and a physical being. So a hypothesis that fits best with our background information would be that whatever the creator of the universe is, they're limited and perhaps physical and embodied. Maybe some sort of simulation hypothesis can account for that. I don't know. So that's another virtue that needs to be accounted for. And another point is that to make it fit with our background information even more, maybe postulate like a community of limited beings rather than just one unlimited being. Because when we observe complex artifacts be created, typically our background information is that they're created by a collective of limited physical beings. We don't get complex artifacts created typically by one powerful being, let alone an unlimited one, which we never see. We never see a complex artifacts created by an unlimited being. So, yeah. So I guess like even if you forego the point about it just being language relative, there's also these other points where we have the disjunction of limited being hypotheses, and also it fits better for background knowledge. Arguably, right? And actually, like when you introduce a community of gods, there's actually another sense in which you have a huge disjunction of possibilities, because you could have 2 beings, 3 beings, 4 beings, all the way up until infinity. So there's like like when you consider communities of gods, there's the possibilities within those versions of theism, those polytheistic versions of theism. When you consider those, in addition to the various limitations that they might have, it just massively goes up. So, yeah, so that's another point that can be made. And now, I can already tell you what the response to that's going to be. And the response to that's going to be, well, we should still massively favor uniform hypotheses over non-uniform ones. And then the analogy appealed to is this one from Callum Miller, which is, in scientific practice, we would prefer the hypothesis that all protons have positive charge to the hypothesis that every single proton except one proton has positive charge. And so then I guess what my attack would have to go on would be what the disanalogies to that particular case would be. Because I do agree that we would prefer the universal generalization in that case. So what do I make of that? Well, what I make of that is that I think that there are important disanalogies. So one disanalogy is that I think that protons just essentially have their identity fixed by the roles that they play in our theory, and that package of roles among the properties of that like package of roles is having +1 charge, and so its relations that it bears to electrons and like other other things that like the standard model of physics attributes to it. Like and keep in mind that the standard model of physics is a quantum field theory, and in that framework, every proton is built up of the exact same quark fields. Like all quarks have, like, there's no room for like quarks having different charge. Like protons are all indistinguishable within the standard model. There's no room for protons with different charges. I just think that they, like, essentially protons do have +1 charge, and like if it didn't, then we just wouldn't say that it's a proton, right? Like the identity conditions of a proton is that, among other things, it has +1 charge. Maybe one thing that could be said in response to that, though, is, maybe we groupify the proton predicate or something like that. So maybe instead of protons, we talk about proton star. Well, if we're talking about, like, if the thing we're talking about isn't protons, then I don't know why we would expect it to have +1 charge. So I don't really get how that objection is going to work. But in any case, like, maybe this objection isn't sufficient because there are other examples you could multiply that where you couldn't, where the thing in question having the projectable property essentially isn't a plausible route. So, like, I don't know, like all ravens are black, for example. It's not plausible maybe that ravens are essentially black. Like maybe we could have discovered a white raven. So maybe that response alone isn't sufficient to address this argument. But with examples like that, like, I think it's going to be a bit tricky to come up with a good one, because most inductive inferences like that don't warrant total universal generalizations unless the background facts warrant them. Like, they generally give you good evidence that for any f, it'll be a g, rather than like for all f's, there'll be g's. The only cases where you get warrant for the claim that all F's are G's are either cases where we take the generalizations to be instances or byproducts of some general law, and on the Armstrong-Tooley theory, a general law would just be like some second order relation between universals, or they're justified when the sample is already understood to be representative, which is the case in the Bismuth case that I brought up earlier. For example, like if you discover a bunch of ravens and they're black, but all the ravens that you discover are in Australia, then maybe, given that your sample isn't representative, it's biased in a specific way, given that all the ravens that you observed are in Australia, maybe that doesn't justify an inductive projection to a universal generalization. So in order for that inductive projection to work, it has to be representative. So notice that what we're talking about here are what inductive projections are valid. But what's the inductive projection in the theism case? Well, in the theism case, there isn't an inductive projection. We just sit on the armchair and then decide that the version of the design hypothesis the version of it that's such that we can describe it in a short English sentence, just a priori, just sitting on an armchair, I just decided that that's the version that's best. So there isn't really any sample that you've appealed to such that you can say that it's representative. Like at best, maybe if we grant the fine-tuning argument and maybe the cosmological argument, we have a sample of one action that God can create, which is create one universe. But that's not good evidence that God can do all actions, right? That's a sample of one. Or maybe we think that God can create a universe and perform miracles in it, and a bunch of other, things. But even that's a pretty weak sample, to infer that God can do all things. And yeah, so I guess that's one tricky point. Maybe there are things that could be said there, but so what's a further point? Another point, and I grant that this is going to be also controversial, but Humer has this argument in his paper, Is Parsimony a Virtue? Where he argues that, and I'm talking about Michael Humer, where he argues that parsimony is generally a virtue when you have, when there are less adjustable parameters and the data is predicted better when you have, because there are less adjustable parameters in the hypothesis, the set of data that are consistent with the hypothesis is narrower. And so when the data comes in and falls into the range that's consistent with the hypothesis, it gets more confirmed by the hypothesis. So that's why, parsimony is a virtue. It's a virtue because of the likelihoods, because of the fact that simple hypotheses have, predict a narrower range of observations, whereas hypotheses with more adjustable parameters predict a wider range of observations. And so another thought I had is maybe if we can extend this to the proton case, and say, okay, so the proton, the general model of the proton, all protons having the same charge except for n. We can think of that as a general model where n is a parameter representing which protons are in the exception class of protons that have a different charge. And obviously you have the parameter of what the charge is for the rest of the protons. So you can imagine a model like that, call that M1. Then imagine another model, M2, where we just say all protons have the same charge. The data comes in, all the experimental data, and all the data we have basically is of protons all having the same charge. All the evidence we have, every single proton we've observed has had +1 charge. The standard model seems to strongly suggest that protons have +1 charge. And so, as far as our observations go, all observed protons have +1 charge. And so M2 seems to me is confirmed, because if so much as one proton had a different charge, it would have been overwhelmingly it wouldn't even just be disconfirmed. Its falsity would be entailed. So it makes the hypothesis, given that it doesn't have an extra adjustable parameter, it's only consistent with observations that are such that the protons we observe are all of the same charge, right? And so when we observe all protons having the same charge, M2 gets confirmed. M1 is consistent with our observing all protons having +1 charge. I agree that it's consistent with it, because you could have so few protons that we wouldn't observe the protons that have different charges. But the point is, its predictions are spread out over a much larger class of possible observations we could have. So when we learn that all protons are the same charge, we learn that the versions of M1 where we could have observed, where we have all these different possible permutations of the charges that we observe, and the standard model implies perhaps that it leaves room for protons having different charges. Well then, given that all those versions of M1 are ruled out, upon renormalizing, the prediction, the likelihoods are just not as strong. The likelihood ratio of M1 versus M2 overwhelmingly favors M2. And so the idea would then be that we would get, based on the data, based on the experimental data, rather than there being a default a priori preference for M2 over M1, rather what we get is that the experimental data confirms the uniform hypothesis over the non-uniform hypothesis. So that's another disanalogy. Yeah, and I'm tempted to say some more stuff about Groove, but I've been yapping quite a bit. So maybe I'll just leave it there. That's me basically preempting what I would expect the response to be, which is the proton case. I don't think it's convincing. I think that there are disanalogies you can run. But maybe they can appeal to other cases, and then
And then I think also that this objection is going to pose some challenges to evidential arguments for atheism. So I don't know if you wanted to mention something about that, Miles.
Say ciao to a new kind of flavored sparkling water with a dash of real fruit juices. With love, Italy. San Pellegrino Ciao.
Yeah, well, I stole that response from what you wrote under the next objection. And I thought, that's good. That applies here too. This stalking horse objection entails that there can be no evidential arguments for atheism, for naturalism over theism. Why? Well, because X, fill in the blank, can only be evidence against a hypothesis if not X is evidence for that hypothesis. That is to say, the probability of H given X is lower than the probability of H where it was before we knew about X. If and only if the probability of H given not X is greater than the probability where we thought H was before knowing not X. So evil and suffering and divine hiddenness, the demographics of theistic belief, any possible evidence at all cannot disconfirm theism, because the absence of that evidence would then have to hypothetically count as evidence for theism. But then in those cases, you can always give the stalking horse objection, blah, 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 and augmented naturalism. So to be probabilistically coherent, the proponent of this objection would have to say that there's no possible evidential arguments or evidence against theism. Really? Are we sure about that? What price for the success of the stalking horse objection? I think it's clearly too high. The machinery of the stalking horse objection obviously goes wrong somewhere.
Yeah, and again, we recognize that there are responses available to defenders of the stalking horse objection. I think they might say here like, oh well, there can still be evidence against theism. It's just like the stalking horse brings out somehow that theism has like a hopelessly low intrinsic probability or prior probability. But we're just not going to get into those sorts of things. We're just going to leave what we said on the table and move on. So the next objection.
Yeah. So the point about if you want to run the stalking horse objection, then you rule out arguments against theism. I'm just going to read out a quote by Niels Manson. I have it saved in my notes here, so I'm just gonna read it out. First, it need not extend past God's motives prior to creation. And this is in regards to the divine psychology objection. Not quite the stalking horse objection, but it can be used to extend to the stalking horse objection. Anyways, ask fine-tuning skeptics to imagine God alone at the very metaphysical beginning, so to speak, with God deciding whether and what to create. Then ask them to say what they think is likely to happen next. They will say they have no idea. But consistent with that, they might maintain that if God decided to create a physical world in which life could develop, they would expect to see this or that specific feature, e.g. great beauty, lots of signs and wonders, no evil or suffering, and so on. It is like saying that you have no idea whether the next person you meet has the means or desire to have children. That is perfectly consistent with saying that you expect the next person you meet to have bought some children's clothing if they do have children. So while fine-tuning skeptics might, in fact, adhere to a more sweeping skepticism about God's intentions and activities, it is possible to be a fine-tuning skeptic while agreeing that evil would be evidence against God's existence, or that there would be evidence of God's existence if, for example, the stars miraculously rearranged themselves to spell out the Nicene Creed. So I think that's a nice little quote because he also addresses the awesome theistic argument there. But the basic idea is that what the fine-tuning skeptic is committed to is antecedently we have no idea what God's likely to do prior to creation. We have no way of setting out a probability to God creating a universe fine-tuned for life. Prior to creation, right? Prior to creation is just inscrutable, according to the fine-tuning skeptic, maybe. Although this is more related to divine psychology than stalking horse. So, but what stalking horse I think does imply is that maybe prior to creation, you wouldn't there's no evidence that you could appeal to prove to sort of evidence theism that wouldn't run afoul of stalking horse naturalism, perhaps. But nonetheless, once you conditionalize on some background information, then perhaps theism in conjunction with that background information makes certain hypotheses about God's intentions more likely. And so he uses the example with like the Nicene Creed. But I mean, to me, it's just a trivial point that like all the time it's going to be the case that like there are many cases where the bare possibility of something conditional on no relevant background information is just undefined. Whereas once you conditionalize on certain background information, then you have enough information such that the probabilities do become defined. Another example you could have of this is like similar to the example that Manson was talking about but imagine, I am to think about the probability of some random person on the street. What's the probability that they have an ace of diamonds in their hand? Conditional on nothing. Well, I think the probability is just undefined, right? Like relative to what? What's the reference class for possible things that could be in this random person's hand that I'm supposed to make my probability judgment relative to? I just think it's undefined. Like I don't think that there is a probability that could be assigned there. That's what I think. Maybe Joe would disagree, like, or maybe Miles would disagree. Like, but I think that's pretty clear. But conditional on me randomly shuffling a deck of cards and asking them to pick a random card from a deck, what's the probability that they'll have the ace of? Was it the ace of diamonds that I said? I actually forget what I said. Was it the ace of diamonds or the ace of hearts? Whichever one I said. What's the probability that they would have that card in their hand after picking out that random card? Well, the probability is 1 in 52 because it's a randomly shuffled deck of cards and a randomly sampled deck of cards. given that it's random and it's a random selection that's happening, it's a 1 in 52 chance. So conditional on me shuffling a deck and then them pulling the card out, we have perfectly defined probabilities for the deck of cards, for them having ace diamonds on their hand. But we don't have perfectly defined probabilities conditional on nothing. So I think you can just say the same thing about theism. And I think this is going to be relevant to the response to the divine psychology thing too. That you can say conditional on God already having created a universe with life. Conditional on that. Sure, you would expect God to treat his sentient creatures or his loving creation well, assuming that God is a loving being and God is perfectly good. We should expect him to, perhaps abide by certain deontological norms. I mean, what the specific predictions to cash out here might depend on your specific normative theory, but regardless, you wouldn't expect tremendous suffering, plausibly, perhaps, like at least consistent with making this stalking horse response. You could still say this. You still could say that, like, the universe or fine-tuning isn't evidence for theism over naturalism, because of these divine psychology, stalking horse-related concerns. Because we have no idea what God would do at the beginning of creation. Well, that's more related to the divine psychology worry, but more related to stalking horse. The appeal to, alternate explanations might be relevant there that it otherwise wouldn't be in the case where we don't conditionalize on the right sort of background information. Like it's at least consistent. Like maybe not a plausible move, but it's at least consistent with the proponent of the stalking horse objection to say that. I think. Like they don't have to say that it's always legitimate to say that there's like there's always a legitimate rival stalking horse hypothesis relative to theism. Maybe it's only legitimate to invoke stalking horse in certain contexts, right? I think maybe what this would give up on, though, is that once we conditionalize on certain background information, then you would have to say that good things are evidence for theism. So maybe that's against the spirit of what the stalking horse naturalist wants to say. But I don't think that that's much of a cost. I mean, like if you like, I think it just is the case that if you conditionalize on certain background information, you should say good thing evidence for theism and bad thing evidence against theism. But maybe this restricts the application of the stalking horse objection, because maybe they want it to apply even once we conditionalized on certain background information. But at the very least, I feel like I'm spelling out a potential route here that's consistent. Anyways, I'm just going to move on.
The final objection we want to cover very briefly is like worries about divine psychology. Like, hey, we don't know what God would do. God's beyond our ken. He's infinitely more cognitively sophisticated than us. These sorts of things. So how are you, dear proponents of fine-tuning arguments, so confident about what God would do? One thing to say here is again, like we don't need to claim that the relevant data is like highly probable conditional on theism. So we don't need to make like probable judgments about what God would do. Like we only need the, at least by my light, like highly plausible claim that God is not like overwhelmingly, absurdly, ludicrously, pathetically unlikely to make a life-permitting universe, at least conditional on there being a universe with such and such law structures. I think actually, if anything, the kind of epistemic humility that this objection is calling us to should lead us to assign like non-extreme probabilities here, thereby vindicating the fine-tuning argument. Like not as extreme as like what these proponents would need in order to avoid the fine-tuning.
Yeah. So I feel like this is just kind of missing the point of divine psychology objections, if I'm being honest with you, because the point of divine psychology objections isn't that we have to assign these massive credences. Like part of what the divine psychologist objector is saying is that we're not justified in any credences at all, right? It's just inscrutable what the probabilities are, right? In such a way that, like, we aren't justified in any likelihood judgments. So that doesn't require extreme credences. Inscrutability isn't a credence. Maybe you can say it's like a convex set of probability functions, like all probabilities that are less than or equal to 0 and greater than or equal to 1, maybe. So you can like express it with interval notation. But I think that that's more of like a sure, you could formalize it that way, but that's not really accurate to what inscrutability really is, because inscrutability more accurately would be like withholding any sort of like if something is inscrutable, you wouldn't have like some set of probability functions, even if that's a useful sort of heuristic way to think about it. You would just like not assign any probability realistically at all. So I don't think that I don't think that there's this appeal to humility that's worrying for the divine psychologists, because I feel like, you know, ignorance priors are the most humble priors that you could assign, right? I feel like inscrutability is like there's nothing immodest about that. There's nothing extreme about that. There's no big number that they're committed to assigning on naturalism or theism. Part of what's being denied might just be that we have to use these additive credences in the first place, which is what I was suggesting earlier. Like, why bother using these additive credences if the structure of additive credences forces you to distribute, you know, overwhelming confidence to disjunctive propositions that are just completely they could be completely unsupported, but just the mere fact that they're disjunctive means that they're overwhelmingly supported. I just think that that's crazy. And I guess I should point out now that I am aware that, like, so a friend of mine, a friendly acquaintance of mine at least, he was the one that introduced me to a lot of this Norton stuff, and he did run by Joe a lot of the stuff around the inductive disjunction fallacy. And so Joe is like, I don't think he's like, I'm not sure, like, okay, I should say more to the point. I'm not sure if he has directly read John Norton's work on this stuff. He has a pretty big corpus of work related to this, but I know that he has given a response to like my friendly acquaintance Stuff of Stars presented him with this these sorts of objections, and if I recall correctly, what Joe basically said was, well, what about a case where we infer air molecules are very unlikely to be in a state of, you know, extreme non-equilibrium, where they're packed into a corner of the room. And the reason why we don't infer that is because of some uniform measure over the possible microstates of the set of air molecules. And so, well, isn't this a case where we apply the fact that there is a large disjunction of outcomes that are different, that and we assign a uniform measure over them? Isn't that a case where, you know, it just seems like this appeal to inductive disjunction isn't is perfectly legitimate, I should say. Well, okay, so that, I think that example is like a really bad one, if I'm not gonna lie. I mean, to me, it's just manifestly clear that the probabilities here are coming from statistical mechanics, which is a highly empirically confirmed theory. So these probabilities aren't just these like a priori symmetry priors. They're coming from they're a posteriori. They're grounded in real theory, with laws, and like we have like background information about the dynamics of that theory, and a variety of things. I mean, indeed, like the kind of probability that's involved here, I think fits pretty well with a Humean view of probability. One example of a Humean view of probability is Albert. So David Albert and Barry Lower, they have this view called the Mentaculus, where they basically say that like we start out with a microcanonical distribution of the initial state of the universe. So they have two things, I think maybe three. I can't remember if there was a third one, but they have like the past hypothesis and a statistical postulate. So we assume a low entropy past, and then we do like a microcanonical distribution over that initial low entropy state. And it's a uniform prior over the possible microcanonical distributions. And you know, like maybe you're tempted to say here, oh, isn't a uniform prior, isn't that like the very inductive disjunction fallacy that you're accusing me of? Well, no, because the reason why we're doing that is because because it returns, first of all, it returns as theorems the laws of statistical mechanics, and it fits with our actual history. So there's a constraint that it has to be a best systemization of our actual history, our actual observations of the empirical regularities and various facts about our history that there are. Our observations of high entropy states, lower entropy states tending towards higher entropy states and things like that. And so I would say that like it's not just that this is a case that doesn't vindicate this sort of like a priori use of inductive disjunction reasoning, but I think I think it's just a perfectly fine empirically grounded example. Like it's a perfectly good an example of perfectly good probabilistic reasoning, in contrast to the sort of reasoning that I would attack that's being used here. Yeah. So that's what I would say to that.
Because again, like to avoid the fine-tuning argument, you need to basically be like overwhelmingly confident, seemingly irrationally, that God wouldn't do this, that he wouldn't.
Again, I just don't think that that's true. Like you could you don't have to be overconfident. You just say that it like you could just assign uninformative ignorance assumptions, right? And again, like what I would say is that like if you're insistent on imposing an additive credence over this, then like on what basis are we saying that the credence isn't massively low? Because the fact that your credence is additive means that you have to put your credence in God instantiating this particular outcome against your credence in like this massive disjunction of other possible outcomes that God can do, like God creating chocolate ice cream, God creating there's a world with just chocolate ice cream, God creating a world with just cheese. Like there's just a massive disjunction of possible outcomes relative to the one possible outcome of God creating a universe with life permitting constants or whatever. And so it seems like if we're willing to countenance an additive credence here, on what basis are we saying that it's not massively low? Because it seems like additivity and normalizability, the conjunction of additivity and normalizability, which really together are the two main parts of a probability distribution. Of course, there's non-negativity too, but that's not as relevant to the point here. But in any case, yeah. God, my brain is like not working right now. Yeah, like I've basically exhausted like pretty much the majority of what I want to say, but I'm going to keep going anyways. But the point I'm making here is that I don't think that someone who runs the divine psychology objection is committed to this extreme irrational confidence. I think the extreme irrational confidence would be what they're committed to if they were committed to, in addition, some sort of additive credence to describe their to avoid the fine-tuning argument. But I don't think that they are committed to an additive credence. I think they could just say that it's inscrutable. They can represent their probability as like a convex set, or they could just say that like they could just use like ignorance notation, like this, the sort of thing that some sort of ignorance function, the sort of thing that I alluded to earlier. They could just say that the the value they assign to it is not some numerical credence value, but just ignorance.
Make a life-permitting universe. I also think, like, here, there's also, like, the awesome theological argument, you know, like, if the initial conditions spelled out made by God with love, like, it seems like you could also make all these points about divine psychology. It's like, oh, you know, God's beyond our ken. Oh, you know, he's infinitely more cognitively sophisticated than us. Oh, we don't know what he would do. It's like, no, that clearly is very powerful evidence for it.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to bring this back up again, but whether this works depends on, well, first of all, I think premise 2 is going to be unmotivated, regardless of what we substitute. But if we substitute divine psychology here, do we have positive reason to think that the argument, that this premise is true? Sorry, I should say. I think we do have some positive reason to think that this premise would be false if we substitute divine psychology with X objection. Why do I think that? Well, I think that in this case, the strength of the inductive inference does not depend on reasoning about goods beyond our ken or anything like that. Like, it's just an inductive inference from what we've observed other agents to do to this particular case of like a set of linguistic tokens being instantiated in the stars. We inductively infer that like, given our background knowledge, that this is likely to be another instance of that. So, assuming that this inductive inference works, I don't think that it's defeated by X objection. But the reason why it's not defeated by X objection, does that apply to the fine-tuning argument? Well, no, because the same material facts aren't there. It seems like, you know, in order to reason about like what God is likely to do for the fine-tuning argument, you do have to sort of speculate about divine psychology, whereas like it doesn't seem really necessary for the ATA case, because the ATA case is just licensed by what in general, you know, agents are likely to do. So I think that if you substitute divine psychology with X objection here, this premise just ends up being false. Plausibly. And that's on top of it being already, I think, unmotivated. Oops. Wrong one.
For theism. And then I guess a third thing here is that, like, the more you lean into these sorts of responses, the less you're going to be able to find atheistic arguments. I think you're going to basically say goodbye to the best atheistic arguments. Like, you're not going to be able to say that the evil is seemingly any evidence against God's existence, hiddenness, religious disagreement, etc. And I don't know, that's a pretty big price to pay. And again, if the world, we can do it in the reverse direction, like the awesome atheological argument, where the world is just like this torture world and being an excruciating agony for every waking moment of their existence, and they're innocent and no good to prove they're from. Like, clearly that would be very good evidence against theism. But it seems like this divine psychology objection would debar us from even saying that. So that's what I got.
Right. Okay. I don't really think that, like, I'm like, what are we gonna do? Am I gonna pull up the Niels Manson quote again? Like, I feel like I made my point on that objection clear already. I made it in the context of the stalking horse objection. I feel like it's more pertinent for this divine psychology objection, because since that's the dialectical context in which that Manson quote exists in the first place, and it's a little bit hard to see how it applies to the stalking horse objection. But I think that it at least shows that it's consistent to use it, and also think that there could be evidence against theism. I mean, in particular, I think that you could say that evil is evidence against theism conditional on design being true, because maybe you can say that it reduces the probability, like, even though like you don't get evidence for bare design. You can't get evidence, like no evidence could give you evidence for bare design is maybe what the stalking horse objection might imply. You still could get evidence that makes less versions of the design hypothesis less probable than other versions of the design hypothesis. And maybe the problem of evil is like one of those arguments that can do that. Whereas like maybe like the arguments for theism, like psychophysical harmony, can increase the probability of theism within the space of the conditional and the divine design hypothesis. And I guess it's consistent. Like you can say it's consistent with that. Like saying that's consistent with saying that there's no evidence that you could have of the bare design hypothesis. And even then, I don't think the stalking horse proponent is committed to saying that there couldn't be any evidence for the design hypothesis, because I think that they could say that, like, specifically the ATA case is evidence for the bare design hypothesis because of some inductive inference that wouldn't be operant. So the relevant material facts that, you know, constitute the license for the inductive inference wouldn't be there for the fine-tuning case, but it would be there for the awesome theistic argument case. So yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. I mean, that's all I got in me. I mean, like, I managed to get through all the objections, and thanks again to Sullivan for joining. And yeah, check out his blog. He has a nice post on the fine-tuning argument. Yeah, I'm exhausted. Jesus, like that did damage.